The hospital was quiet. It was one of those nights where the stillness seemed almost unnatural, as though the world outside had completely stopped moving. Emergency lights flickered faintly, casting a soft, almost eerie glow on the sterile white walls of the hospital corridor. Everything was quiet except for the occasional sound of footsteps echoing down the empty hallways as the staff worked the late shift. Nurses moved from room to room, their voices barely audible, exchanging brief, polite words about the patients they tended to, their minds constantly shifting between tasks. It was a typical night, the kind of night you could almost forget you were in a place where life and death balanced precariously on every decision made. Tonight, though, there was something in the air that felt different. Something that wasn't quite right, but no one could put their finger on it. It was the kind of night that was seemingly uneventful, where the most chaos that would unfold might be the screech of a wheelchair or a monitor's flatline. But tonight would change that. The automatic doors at the hospital's main entrance slowly slid open, and the low hum of the machine's motors echoed through the emptiness. The nurses barely glanced up, assuming it was just another patient being wheeled in. But what entered the hospital was not a patient, not even a person. Instead, it was a German shepherd. The dog moved cautiously, yet with purpose, as if it knew exactly where it needed to go. Its coat was matted with dry mud, the fur clumped together in tangled patches that gave it a weathered, worn-out look. Its deep brown eyes reflected exhaustion, but there was something else in them, something unmistakable: resolve. This was no ordinary dog. This was Max, a retired canine police officer who had served with distinction on the force. His gait was slower now, a reflection of the years that had passed since his last mission, but there was still an undeniable strength in every movement. Max did not bark. He did not wag his tail. He walked calmly, with a steady pace, his eyes scanning the room around him. In his mouth, he carried something, a bundle carefully wrapped in a faded cloth. The nurses froze. They had never seen anything like it. A dog, in a hospital, carrying a baby. They exchanged confused glances, unsure of what to do. One of the nurses, a young woman named Sarah, hesitated. Her heart raced, but curiosity got the better of her. With slow, deliberate steps, she approached the dog. Her hand reached out, shaking slightly, as she gently unwrapped the bundle from the cloth. The room seemed to hold its breath as the nurse revealed the baby inside. Her eyes widened in shock, and she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper, "Oh my God, it's a baby." The air seemed to leave the room, leaving only a thick tension hanging in the silence. The baby was tiny, frail, barely breathing. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its chest rose and fell erratically, as if the very act of breathing was a struggle. For a moment, it felt as though the world had frozen. The emergency room, once quiet and still, erupted into action. The nurses and doctors rushed into the room, their movements fast and practiced as they snapped into their roles. Someone shouted for the oxygen supply, another called for the crash cart, while others scrambled to get vital signs. Every second counted. The baby's life hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of a fragile thread. Max stood still, watching. His eyes never left the baby. He was calm, unafraid, and unshaken by the chaos unfolding around him. His posture was steady, his gaze unwavering, but there was an underlying desperation in his eyes, a silent plea for help. The doctors worked quickly, checking the baby's heart rate and oxygen levels, while the nurses adjusted the flow of air from the oxygen tank. The baby's tiny form lay in the center of the room, surrounded by medical equipment, beeping monitors, and the sharp smell of antiseptic. The tension was palpable. No one spoke, their faces masks of concentration as the seconds stretched into minutes. One of the doctors, Dr. Henry, barked out orders, checking the baby's vital signs. "His breathing is shallow. We need N4, now. His body temperature's dangerously low. Someone, check his pulse." A nurse rushed to the infant, her hands trembling as she connected N4 line. The baby's chest rose and fell, its breaths shallow and uneven. The heart monitor let out a soft, weak beep, signaling just how critical the situation was. Max, though exhausted, did not move from his place by the entrance. His eyes never wavered from the baby. His body was thin, worn out from years of service, but his presence in the room seemed to anchor everything. The medical staff worked tirelessly, trying to stabilize the baby, but their minds kept coming back to the same question: how did Max know? How had he known to bring the baby here? How did he know? Sarah whispered under her breath, her voice filled with disbelief. How could a dog? But there was no time for answers. The baby was still fighting for its life. Slowly, the infant's condition started to stabilize. The medical team was cautious but hopeful. The heart rate monitor beeped slightly faster, a sign that the baby was improving, however minutely. The baby's skin was still cold, its body frail, but it was alive. And that was something. Max stood motionless by the door, his eyes fixed on the baby as if he were waiting for something, a miracle, perhaps, or an answer. Minutes later, a soft voice echoed in the room. The baby's vitals are stabilizing. His heart rate is stronger, and his breathing is less labored. He's not out of the woods yet, but he's fighting. It was the first glimmer of hope anyone in the room had felt. The doctors and nurses exchanged brief, relieved glances, but there was no time for celebration. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Before anyone could fully digest what had happened, the police arrived. Officer Daniels, the lead investigator, walked into the emergency room, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. The nurses quickly recounted the bizarre story, their voices filled with awe. "We have no idea where the dog came from," the head nurse said, her voice still trembling. "He brought the baby in, placed him on the floor, and just stood there. We thought it was a patient at first, but this isn't possible." Officer Daniels looked at Max, who had not moved an inch since he entered the hospital. He was calm, yet his gaze was still sharp. "A dog brought a baby to the hospital," he muttered to himself, incredulity written across his face. "That's hard to believe." He motioned to his team. "Has anyone scanned for a chip?" A young officer approached Max cautiously, holding a scanner. But as soon as he got too close, Max stepped back, his posture tense, though not aggressive. His eyes were full of warning. Max was not an ordinary dog. "This dog's been trained," the officer said, clearly impressed. "He might be a retired canine." Officer Daniels nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Let's find out where he came from. Keep your distance." Max led them out of the hospital, walking with steady purpose, as though he knew exactly where he was going. The officers followed in silence, the glow of the patrol car lights casting long shadows across the quiet streets. As they moved through the city, one officer murmured, "Where's he taking us?" The answer came soon enough. Max stopped in front of an old, dilapidated house, tucked away in a desolate part of town. The door was ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. Officer Daniels frowned, sensing something was off. "This is it," he murmured to his team. They cautiously approached the door. Inside, the smell of mold and stale air greeted them, mingling with the faint scent of rotting food. The house was abandoned, its walls cracked and decaying. Max led them through a cluttered living room and toward a small, dimly lit room at the back. When they opened the door, the scene was haunting. In the corner, an old crib stood, abandoned and empty. Around it, signs of a life once lived, dog food bowls, a tattered blanket, children's items scattered across the floor. But it was the crib that spoke volumes. The baby had once been here. Max approached the crib, sniffing the spot where the baby had been. He was exhausted now, his mission complete. His body collapsed beside the crib, his posture limp, his breathing shallow. But his eyes remained open, vigilant, watching over the scene. The officers continued their search through the house, their flashlights cutting through the dust and debris. There was no sign of the mother, but it was clear. Someone had been living here recently, though everything spoke of neglect. The chairs were overturned, cabinets stood empty, and papers littered the floor. One officer found a crumpled envelope. Inside was a letter, written hastily, the handwriting shaky and unclear. I no longer have the strength to care for him. Everything is falling apart. All I have left is Max, and I know he will do the right thing. I hope someone will forgive me. The letter was unsigned, but its message was unmistakable. The mother, overwhelmed by despair, had entrusted her child to the only companion she had left, her loyal dog, Max. And Max had done exactly as she asked. The officers continued their search, following the clues. Eventually, they located the mother, Rachel, wandering in a nearby park, her eyes vacant, her body emaciated with exhaustion. At the sight of her son's name, the spark of hope flickered in her eyes. She had been living on the edge, teetering between life and death, but now, after so much pain, she had a reason to hope again. Max walked beside Rachel as they made their way to the hospital, his pace steady, his posture protective. When they entered the pediatric care unit, Rachel saw her son for the first time since Max had brought him in. Her heart surged with emotion. The baby was alive, and slowly, miraculously, he was improving. Max stood at the doorway, watching silently, his duty fulfilled. The doctors and nurses watched the scene unfold, moved by the profound bond between a mother, her child, and the dog who had saved them both. Rachel stood in the doorway of the pediatric care unit, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of the doorframe. She had not seen her son since Max had carried him to the hospital. It had been days filled with pain, confusion, and overwhelming fear. Now, standing on the threshold of the room where Noah was lying, she felt a mixture of emotions she could hardly contain. Max, the dog who had saved her son, stood quietly beside her, his body still weary but his eyes as watchful and alert as ever. His gaze remained focused on the small bed in the center of the room, where Noah lay. The baby, no longer as pale and frail as before, had regained some color in his cheeks. His chest rose and fell steadily, his breathing more regular than it had been when he first arrived. But he was still so small, so fragile. Rachel's heart ached as she took in the sight of him, her little boy, alive and fighting for his life. A single tear slipped down her cheek, though it wasn't just the sadness of the past few days that caused it. This tear was different, it was one of relief, of gratitude, of hope. She stepped inside the room slowly, her feet hesitant, as though she were afraid to disturb the delicate peace that had settled around them. The doctors and nurses, who had been monitoring Noah's condition around the clock, stepped back as she approached the bed. One of the nurses, a gentle woman named Linda, smiled softly at Rachel and gave her a nod of encouragement. "He's stable now, Rachel," Linda said, her voice calm and soothing. "It's still a long road to recovery, but he's strong. He's a fighter, just like his mother." Rachel didn't trust herself to speak. She merely nodded, her hand instinctively reaching out toward Noah. As she touched his tiny hand, she felt the warmth of life flow through her, filling the hollow spaces that had once been consumed by fear and uncertainty. She felt a deep, almost overwhelming sense of relief. Max, still standing just inside the door, watched the scene with calm eyes. His body was slumped, the exhaustion of his journey catching up to him. He had done his duty. He had brought the child to safety, and now, his work was done. But even in his tired state, Max remained vigilant, watching over the room, his presence a quiet reminder of the incredible bond between him and the family he had protected. Rachel bent down, gently brushing Noah's hair back from his forehead. Her heart swelled with love for her son, but she couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of guilt that lingered in the back of her mind. She thought back to the difficult days that had led to this moment, days filled with despair, when she had felt that everything was slipping out of her grasp. Her strength had run out long before she had reached this point. But then Max had appeared. Max had been there when she couldn't be. When she had been too weak, too hopeless, he had stood by her side, guarding them both with a loyalty that went beyond anything she could have imagined. She had entrusted him with her son's life, and he had delivered. She could never fully express what she felt for this dog, this loyal, selfless creature who had become her son's savior. The room remained silent for a few moments, the steady beeping of the monitors the only sound breaking the stillness. Rachel turned to look at Max, her voice barely a whisper. "You saved him," she said, her throat tight with emotion. "You saved my son." Max's eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, it was as though he understood every word. He gave a small wag of his tail, his body slumping slightly as if he were allowing himself to rest at last. His mission had been completed. The world had felt so heavy for him, yet now, there was a peace in his demeanor, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he had done everything he could. Rachel stepped closer to him, her heart full of gratitude. She reached down, hesitated for a moment, and then gently stroked Max's fur. His coat was matted and worn, the years of service leaving their mark on him. Yet, in that moment, he felt like the most important being in the world to her. He had given everything to ensure that her son would survive. She couldn't begin to imagine what it had cost him, but she would be forever grateful. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'll never forget what you've done for us." Max's tail gave a small, almost imperceptible wag, and he lowered his head, closing his eyes for a moment. It was as if he knew that he could finally let go, finally allow himself to rest. He had done his job. Now, it was time for him to heal. Rachel stayed by Noah's side for hours, her eyes never leaving him as she gently stroked his tiny hand, watching as his breathing became more steady. Slowly, the color in his face began to return, and the tiny, fragile baby that had been on the brink of death now seemed to be finding the strength to survive. As the hours passed, Rachel's exhaustion caught up with her. She hadn't slept properly in days, and the weight of everything she had been through was beginning to take its toll. Yet, despite her weariness, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope. Noah was still here, and he was going to be okay. It was well into the night when Rachel finally allowed herself to close her eyes for a few moments, her head resting against the side of the crib as she drifted into a light sleep. The soft beeping of the machines, the rhythmic sound of Noah's breathing, and the occasional shuffle of nurses outside the room were the only things that filled the silence. Max lay near the doorway, his body curled up into a tight ball, his exhaustion evident in every part of him. He had done more than anyone could have ever expected. But now, with his task completed, he could rest. Time passed, and the steady progress of Noah's recovery became more apparent. The doctors and nurses marveled at how quickly he was responding to treatment, his body slowly regaining strength. There were no guarantees, of course. But with each passing day, the small infant showed more and more signs of life, and Rachel's hope grew. Days turned into weeks, and as the weeks passed, Rachel and Noah made small but steady progress. The pain and uncertainty that had clouded their lives slowly began to fade as they were surrounded by the loving care of the hospital staff and the kindness of strangers who had heard their story. A group of community members, inspired by Rachel's resilience and Max's heroic actions, had come together to offer support. They brought gifts for Noah, food, clothes, and even toys for the little boy who had captured the hearts of so many. One afternoon, as Rachel stood outside the hospital, the sunlight warming her skin, she realized just how much had changed. The darkness of her past had lifted, and she now stood on the edge of a new beginning. A new chapter in her life was about to unfold, and she was ready to embrace it. She looked down at Noah, who was now able to sit up on his own, his bright, curious eyes searching the world around him. "Look at you," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "You're getting stronger every day." Max stood by her side, as loyal as ever. He watched Noah with calm, knowing eyes, his posture relaxed but still alert. He had been with them through it all, and though his body was tired, there was a quiet strength in him that couldn't be extinguished. Rachel turned to look at Max, a deep, sincere gratitude in her gaze. She bent down and scratched behind his ears. "You've given us everything, Max. Thank you." Max's eyes softened, and his tail gave a small wag. He had already given so much, and in return, he had received something priceless: love, respect, and the knowledge that he had made a difference in a world that sometimes seemed filled with too much pain. As Rachel continued to gaze at the world around her, she knew that their journey wasn't over yet. There were still challenges ahead, still hurdles to overcome, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face them. With Noah by her side, and Max, her loyal protector, watching over them, she knew they could survive anything that came their way. And for Max, there was no greater reward than knowing that he had done his duty, that he had saved not just a baby, but a family. In the end, his mission had been more than just a job. It had been a testament to loyalty, love, and sacrifice. Rachel, Noah, and Max had all come through the darkness together. Now, they stood on the edge of a bright new future, ready to embrace whatever came next.